what I'm going to present here today, now it works. Yeah. What I will try to explain is that the accommodation of territorial diversity is one of the biggest challenges that complex societies must face nowadays, especially in a context where secessionist movements are on the rise. We can think of the cases of Catalonia in Spain, Scotland in Italy, Scotland in the UK, or, for example, the Veneto in Italy. And multi-level government, either in federal or regional form, plays a key role in managing diversity and reducing the risk of secession, being the financial component, a vital item of any system of shared government, as the lack of financial resources to finance constitutionally assigned competencies would render autonomy inoperable, reducing them to an empty vessel. So in this part, we have equalization mechanisms, because decentralization sometimes have a cost in terms of economic efficiency because of divergences in financial capacities or differences in needs due to a different set of reasons I will not go into detail. So equalization mechanisms are envisaged to bridge this gap, to reduce disparities among subunits, to achieve a certain degree of horizontal equity. Therefore, equalization can be defined as a transfer of fiscal resources across jurisdiction with the aim of offsetting these differences in either revenue-raising capacity or public service cost. So therefore, the main objective of equalization programs is to allow subunits to provide a comparable level of services at comparable level or at similar levels of taxation. So equalization can be seen as a necessary part to decentralization, and it should come as no surprise that in most multi-level and most federal systems we can find equalization programs, with the exceptions of the USA and Mexico. So behind equalization lies this idea of horizontal solidarity, of redistribution among the territorial subunits that share a common state. So in my view, this is what I try to do in the project. Solidarity and horizontal equity can be used as a tool to hold the country together, to foster unity, in the end, discouraging secessionist attempts. And in the project, and this is what I will try to briefly explain today, I try to construct a benchmark, focusing on those components of the internal architecture of equalization mechanisms whose nature is connected to the notion of fiscal constitution in a broader sense, and therefore I try to not only focus on those elements formally incorporating a legally binding document, but also customary, traditional, and widely accepted precepts, what we can define more or less as soft law. So in particular, I focus on the internal architecture of equalization programs, on those several elements that you have there in the slide, and that I will come back to them in a moment. So in the analysis, I borrowed the concepts of integration and disintegration from the literature on European integration, and I try to apply them to the internal dynamics that occur in multi-level systems, between the central level and the territorial subunits, and also between the territorial subunits among themselves. So an aspect of equalization, for example, the territorial participation in the governance of the compact, that contributes to strengthen the ties between the national level and the territorial subunits, promoting dialogue and cooperation, is defined in this in my framework, in my theoretical framework, as leading to integration. On the other hand, an aspect that weakens the ties between the territorial subunit and the national level, hindering dialogue and cooperation, is defined as disintegrative. In the same vein, the lack of participation by the territorial subunits may be also understood as undermining the principle of horizontal solidarity and therefore as promoting disintegration. In the end, the aim is to identify those aspects that may increase the allegiance to the parent state, promoting dialogue and cooperation, and reducing tensions and appeasing conflicts, as well as those that may hinder these values, fostering disintegration and increasing the rejection of the current political settlement. So now I will go back to these 7 elements I mentioned before that you will see in a table that I'm afraid it's maybe too small to be seen from the screen, so I apologize beforehand for that. And the first element that I take into account is the legal entrenchment of the program. Basically, which legal document contains the equalization compact. And basically here we can distinguish between 3 main models. The equalization compact can be either in the Constitution, in a legal statute, or can even be, as in the case of Australia, entrenched through informal consensus, so through an intergovernmental agreement. So, according to the benchmark, the stronger the legal foundations of an equalization mechanisms, and consequently the highest integrative force is achieved through a constitutionally assigned a constitutionally entrenched provision, that sets out the goals of equalization, that ideally should be developed in technical terms in a legal statute that is approved by a chamber that represents the subnational governments. The second element that I analyze in my framework is the nature of the redistribution. The nature of the redistribution that refers to the overall funding of equalization with a particular emphasis on the origin of the funds. So here we can distinguish between vertical equalization, those models where the financial transfers are designed, administered, and paid by the national government, and horizontal equalization where the grant is paid from the relatively richer subunits to the relatively poorer subunits. So equalization can be used as an instrument for deflating secessionist claims in those subunits that are net receivers of funds, because these programs raise the cost of secession for the receiving subunit. We can think of equalization as a trade-off between transfers and allegiance to the existing constitutional framework of the nation-state. The integrative force that these mechanisms embed is even more intense towards fostering national unity as in horizontal programs, because receiving subunits, they really see the contribution of their federation partners to the well-being of the residents, strengthening the bonds among them. So in this sense, this is also perceived as an integrative force. Furthermore, regarding the nature of the redistribution, we can distinguish between open-ended and closed-ended systems. Open-ended where there is not a limit to the total pool of equalization, closed-ended system when there is a limit to the total pool of equalization, and therefore it turns into a zero-sum game with winners and losers. And this, of course, can lead to disintegration. Furthermore, we can also distinguish another dimension between integrated programs where all subunits get transfers, because these programs normally feature a revenue sharing component. This is perceived as an integrative force, or standalone programs where only some subnational units get transfers, for example, if we think of the Canadian equalization program. And therefore, only those that are under a certain average or a center standard receive transfers. And of course, this leads to clashes between the subnational units themselves and also towards the federal government. And this is perceived in my model as disintegrative. A third dimension is the level and component of equalization. Here we can distinguish between full equalization that basically aims at offsetting all the differences, and of course it requires a big pool of money, a big vertical fiscal gap, and partial equalization where only a certain margin is designed to be distributed, so the fiscal capacities of certain, they are elevated to a certain standard or to a certain national average. Although full equalization can have a bigger integrative potential, according to my model, partial equalization in overall terms features a higher degree of integration. Why this? Because if we combine the effects toward receiving and or richer subunits and poorer subunits, or receiving and paying subunits, we see that the potential for conflict is higher in full equalization programs. And again, it should come as no surprise that most of the systems in comparative perspective feature partial equalization, sorry. For time reasons, I will not go into the difference between gross and net equalization, and the difference between revenue and needs equalization is pretty straightforward. Revenue equalization targets the fiscal capacity of the territorial subunits. Needs equalization focuses on the needs in terms of providing services for the territorial subunits. Finally, the remaining dimensions, and again I will cut it short for time reasons. We can distinguish between conditional and unconditional programs. Normally, equalization programs are defined as unconditional, and this is an integrative force because the territorial subunits can basically do whatever they want with the money they receive for this issue. So there is no the funds are not conditioned to a certain input or output result. The next dimension is the institutional administering of the program. Here we can distinguish between an independent agency, the Australian model, which should be based on technical independent assessment, or models where the decisions are taken either by the central government or the national parliament or an intergovernmental forum. In theory, according to the model, independent agencies should feature a higher integrative force because the political dimension, the political clashes are left out of the equation, and therefore the decisions on equalization are taken only on technical motives, and there's no political component that usually lead to clashes between the subunits and to the politicization of the compact. This is something that we clearly see, for example, in the Canadian case, with Quebec normally being the scapegoat and Alberta being one of the most complaining provinces about equalization. The length of the program, basically, if the program, all these programs have a long-term vocation, but normally they have a certain time limit that can be distinguished between sunset clauses or formal periodic process of systematic review that we find in most programs. And here we don't find any significant difference in integrative terms between one or the other model. And finally, just to conclude, dispute resolution. Disputes are inherent to equalization, I would say, especially political disagreements about the nature of the compact, but here we focus on how the disputes are solved, and this is telling about the degree of conflict that we can find inside a certain program. And we distinguish between dispute resolution in courts, supreme or constitutional courts. This is not, it only happens in Germany, which is a very particular case. All the equalization laws have been approved by unanimity between the Länder, but all of them have been challenged in front of the Constitutional Court. With the exception of the German case, no, we don't see court challenges in Switzerland or in Canada regarding equalization. And here the integrative potential will depend on the perception of the impartiality of the court, if it's perceived as a territorial arbiter or not. Finally, the other possibility is that disputes are solved through intergovernmental cooperation, and here the integrative potential will depend on the levels of mutual trust and the levels especially of federal culture. If there is a higher level of mutual trust of federal culture, disputes will be probably solved through intergovernmental cooperation easily, the case of Canada again, and here we will find that this is integrative, this has an integrative potential. On the other case, for example, in Spain or in Italy, with low levels of mutual trust and with a lack of federal culture, this probably will result, according to the model, in disintegration. So I will stop here. Thank you very much. And